tackling poverty and collaboration with our community planning partners and our third sector partners and mitigating the impacts where we possibly can. Just to remind everybody that this session is being recorded and it will be placed on social media channels. So if you don't want your image to appear, please feel free to keep your camera off. And again, the normal rules, if we're not speaking, if we could switch our microphones off, and hopefully that will help with the sound recording. So thank you very much for that. So before we start, I'd like to just possibly give a very short reflection on Challenge Poverty Week. I think we've had a busy programme this week. I've certainly had the pleasure of attending most of the sessions. And just reflecting back, I think we were challenged in our opening session to really think about the impacts of poverty and what we could do. Our chair for that session, Natalie Marston from SVE, challenged us to reflect on our learning and what we would commit to doing. And I think that's important for us to keep in our heads as we continue to try and tackle poverty, as we always see 365 days of the year, but we especially focus on it in this week. I think we also had an inspiring input from Councillor Farmer, who's the council leader and the chair of our community planning partnership, really focusing on that collaborative effort across particularly our CPP partners and the work that's happening in our communities to very much focus on recovery. And I think that's our focus for the closing session as well. You know, we recognise that the pandemic has had and will have a more deep impact to those communities who are already vulnerable. So the real imperative for us to continue to work in partnership throughout the CPP process to mitigate that increased impact. I think there was also a community learning development upskilling session in our first day of Challenge Poverty Week, and that's very much about the real importance of CLD and empowering our communities to work with us in partnership, and the practitioners themselves really again committing to continuing to build that partnership working in our 8 locality action plan areas, which are our most vulnerable areas, and to share increasing ways of building resources in partnership and learning in partnership, and looking at collaborative ways again to use more virtual spaces to continue to learn and to share. We also had on Monday and Tuesday of Challenge Poverty Week some sessions on our Thrive to Maximise programme, which is a really innovative programme working and looking at improving well-being, income maximisation and employability across particularly our more vulnerable parents in our communities. Now, those sessions weren't as well attended as we'd hoped, so one of our key learning points from that is to think about other ways where we can promote the Thrive to Maximise programme, because it's a really impactful programme and we want to make sure that message gets out there. So, you know, we will learn from that, and we've already thought about some new ways that we can develop that programme. On Wednesday, though, we had a very well attended event which looked at food dignity, and the clear output from that was to refresh and re-establish the Stirling Food Partnership, which will help us to develop and promote a sustainable, healthy and affordable whole food system, again working with partners from all sectors across the council area. So really delighted that we've managed to get really obvious and strong commitment from a whole range of partners to refresh the Stirling Food Partnership. And similarly on Thursday, again, a really positive output from that was we launched our Stirling's first Stirling Community Justice Third Sector Forum. Again, a real key achievement and something that will continue beyond Challenge Poverty Week. Highlighted really the strengths of partnership working, especially with the third sector, and the critical need to better, there's the postie, to better understand the impacts of poverty and trauma throughout the community and criminal justice system. Excuse me, I'm just going to switch my microphone off to shout at dogs. Apologies, we'll see if that works. And I think that probably the quote of the week came through the session yesterday on community justice, where we had a number of speakers really insightful on the role of all partners in supporting the community justice journey. And one of our partners said that basically from listening to the speaker, she had 1 million light bulbs going off in her head. And I think that's really critical, the learning that we can all benefit from through these type of events in Challenge Poverty Week helps us to shape our services as we go forward. So I think that was a really insightful quote there. And I think as well as those programmes of event, we've had a number of online materials shared. So our Advice and Welfare Reform team shared some really important documents, including income maximisation guide and a guide to welfare benefits, again, particularly important as these benefits change. So we're really delighted to be able to launch those materials during Challenge Poverty Week. And also work that again, a number of people on the call today shared, and looking at an emergency contact leaflet, which I had a look at this morning. And again, that's been really well received. People saying that's tremendously handy to have all of that information in the one place. And we've shared that online, and a number of people have said, let's have that in a whole range of formats because it is so useful. So some really positive feedback. I'd encourage everybody again to look at the Council's Twitter feed and see all the comms, particularly to see the work that's been happening in the schools that's been shared. And also, I guess, to look across the country, looking at the hashtags Challenge Poverty Week and Now is the Time, to see the range of activity that's happened across Scotland and how we can continue to learn and develop and use all of that really strong work that's happening, as I say, to make that impact in our communities throughout the year, and particularly as we move towards recovery. So hopefully that's a wee summary, certainly from my view of what's happened this week. I'd like to thank everybody for taking part, and I hope that this closing session helps us to reflect on the impact of poverty, but also to look at what we can do and what we have the ability to do to mitigate the impacts of poverty, particularly as we now focus on recovery and building the socioeconomic impact that we can create to benefit those communities who are furthest away and who have been most significantly impacted by the pandemic. So to help us with that, we have a couple of guest speakers in this afternoon's session, and I'd like to introduce them for you now. So we have Miriam McKenna, who's joining us from the Improvement Service, and Miriam is the Programme Manager for Inequality, Economy and Climate Change. And we're also delighted to welcome Lindsay Graham with us this afternoon, and Lindsay is a Commissioner with Scotland's Poverty and Inequality Commission. So Miriam and Lindsay are going to give us a couple of inputs, and then we will close with Councillor Chris Kane, who will present the closing remarks for us today. Thank you. So Miriam, if we ask you to share your thoughts with us. Thank you.
Thanks, Leslie. I'll just try and share my screen and get my presentation up, which isn't showing here. If you just give me 2 seconds. It's always, everything's set up, ready to go, and as soon as I try and do anything, it doesn't share properly. Apologies. It was working fine earlier.
I can share it if it's not working.
Hang on a second, sorry, I know what I need to do. Sorry, I've got 2 screens here, so everything's kind of across the 2. If I just put that there. Works every other time I do it. I've been doing it. Okay. There, it's there. Okay. There we are. Sorry about that. Okay, so Inge asked me to come along today and just give you a kind of overview. Listening to Leslie there, it makes me think that I'm teaching my granny to suck eggs here. There's so much you're doing around tackling poverty in Stirling, but I thought it would be worth just sort of maybe going through some of the sort of key points in terms of drivers of poverty and so on, and maybe some ideas of things that you might want to look at when we've been sort of discussing poverty from a national perspective and trying to keep an eye on everything. As Leslie said, I am a Programme Manager in the Improvement Service for Inequality, Economy and Climate Change. Half of my post, I am the National Coordinator for the implementation of the Fairer Scotland duty. I also oversee the National Coordinators for the Local Child Poverty Action Reports and Project Managers for Economic Development and Climate Change as well. So it's been a busy week like yourselves in terms of dealing with Challenge Poverty Week, but it's been really interesting. So as you'll be familiar with, no doubt, the drivers of poverty are set out in Every Child, Every Chance, but this kind of doesn't necessarily just apply to child poverty. It does cut across all ages across Scotland as well. So the priority groups are set out at the top here of the slide, and the Scottish Government have actually recently published an update on this, and I can put the link in the chat later so that you can have a look at that, and it goes through each of the priority groups to see where they are now, but it is pretty much the same story just now. So these families continue to be at higher risk of poverty, and future policies really need to continue to focus on them. And the consultation for the new tackling child poverty plan is underway at the moment with the Scottish Government. So lone parents, as you can see there, are predominantly women, so there's a gender component to that as well. In terms of disabled families, it's whether they've got a child who's disabled or an adult within that family. If you've got 3+ children, minority ethnic, you've got a child under 1 or mothers aged under 25, you're more likely to be living in relative poverty. So that's with after housing costs as well. So there's a need for an individual holistic approach within a framework of understanding the structural barriers to these groups of people in terms of tackling child poverty and poverty in general, in order to avoid perpetuating stereotyping and stigma. And families often belong to more than one priority group. So, for example, among children in relative poverty, 40% of children in lone parent families also have a disabled person at home. Over half of children in a family with a younger mother are also in a lone parent household. And half of children in a 3+ child family are also in a family in which someone is disabled. And the bottom half of the slide sets out the drivers for tackling poverty. They're set out in Every Child, Every Chance as well. So focusing on things like income from employment, but from across 2017 to 20, more than half of all those in relative poverty after housing costs in Scotland lived in a working household. So there's something here about income from employment where it has to be fair, sustainable, well-paid employment that's flexible as well to enable parents to work, but also to earn enough to lift themselves out of poverty. So that amounted to about 400,000 Scottish working age adults that are living and working poverty, and that's 160,000 children. So we're not getting something right there, and more needs to be done to make sure that work is an affordable option for people, but also the support is there for them around things like accessible transport, which is a major barrier in terms of cost, and childcare, and the flexibility of childcare to enable you to actually work a job, but also for businesses to be more flexible. And we spoke about that with TimeWise at the Child Poverty Conference on Wednesday. So there's cross-cutting issues as well of housing, transport and food, which link to the cost of living. And as we know from the news, the cost of living is increasing due to rising prices. You've got inflation, we've got EU exit causing problems with supply. So, and the digital divide is still an issue, but the work through Connecting Scotland helped to address some of this over the pandemic to try and get as many digital devices into lower income households to enable them to access the internet and the services that they might be able to get in there. And in terms of income from social security and benefits in kind, the doubling of the child payment will help some families in receipt of the benefits, but that's kind of offset by the removal of the 20% uplift to universal, £20 uplift to universal credit. And that's going to have an impact on many families who are struggling to make ends meet. But a lot of the work there then is about how to make sure people can access the right kind of benefits, and a lot of the work you were talking about earlier about, Thrive to Maximise and making sure that people are accessing the right kinds of benefits is the sort of key to sort of providing that safety net for people. There's an unequal impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. We've seen a lot of headlines, but we've already seen that those on lower incomes were more negatively impacted by furlough and things like that, where losing 20% of your income was significant. But also those in lower income jobs were exposed more to the infection of COVID-19 as well. So people in precarious, low-paid manual jobs in the caring, retail and service sectors have been more exposed to COVID-19 as their face-to-face jobs can't be done from home. And for a lot of us, we've been very lucky to be able to work from home, but it seems to be largely a preserve of kind of middle-class people or very specific jobs that are generally well-paying. So we've benefited, whereas others have had to go out in the front line and then potentially lose wages if they were to get infected. The increase in costs for heating homes and feeding children has been a challenge for many, and many of those were just about managing before have had to dip into any savings and are now living in poverty. And over a third of low-income families with children increased their spending during 2020, while 40% of high income families without children actually reduced theirs. So there's quite a divide there, and it's growing the inequalities that we're seeing across communities. Education for poorer families was a challenge if they didn't have access to digital devices or broadband, and that can result in poorer educational outcomes, but also an element of isolation from their friends and engaging with services. The increase in domestic violence has been documented, with many women trapped at home in very dangerous circumstances, and there was a lack of services at the start of the pandemic, which has also impacted those families. And a rise in loneliness for many people, especially those shielding, has increased poor mental health and stress. Food poverty is obviously an issue we've mentioned already, with the refresh of the Stirling Food Partnership. And that when councils in Scotland switched to the cash first approach, that was a much better response than providing food parcels for families in need, which we did at the very, very beginning. And it's really important to keep the dignity of people, enable them that choice to stretch the money as far as they can in terms of accessing food. There's been a huge reduction in physical activity for many, so that impacts on health outcomes for a lot, for everyone really, but particularly those who perhaps living in poverty, they're having to use public transport, no resource to private cars, and that further exposes them to the virus. But they're also then working many jobs to try and get by and don't have the opportunity to take a sort of healthier, active lifestyle. And we know that mortality was much higher in elderly people, poorer groups and ethnic minorities. So poorer communities have been more vulnerable to severe disease once infected because of the higher levels of pre-existing illness and comorbidities in the population. And those sort of the changes in the availability and use of healthcare services. We're seeing a lot of stuff on the news now about people now on really, really long waiting lists, but also then, cancers and things are going undetected because people aren't able to access those services. And if there's, a greater risk of ill health in poorer communities, then they would be more impacted. And the wee chart here, I don't know if you'll be able to see it particularly well, is for Stirling, it was the unemployment benefit claimant count. So it shows you how that went up as the pandemic progressed. And so we need to consider, all the people who are unemployed and how we're going to get them back into work. And so there's been a big impact on that. I'll quickly skip through some of these policy levers and legislative drivers that community planning partnerships and the public sector partners particularly are largely subject to. We've been working across all partners to deliver these, but they're even more important now given the impact of COVID. So tackling inequality is at the heart of all of these. And as I set out before, the priority groups for child poverty include a number of protected characteristics, which we have duties under the Equality Act to protect and advance equality of opportunity for. A rights-based approach to tackling poverty can help draw a lot of these different bits of legislation together and the work that we want to do to tackle inequality and poverty. And work at the national level for a statutory human rights framework for Scotland will include the economic, social and cultural rights, which include workplace rights, the right to social security, the right to participation in cultural life, and rights to housing, food, water, healthcare and education. That has a very close correlation with the Fairer Scotland duty. And the revised guidance for that was published on Monday this week. And, so looking at those strategic decisions from a socioeconomic disadvantage perspective and an inequality of outcome perspective is really important within community planning, because you are taking big strategic decisions at a partnership level. And obviously I would say that as the Fairer Scotland Duty Coordinator, but also I can offer support should you require it around the Fairer Scotland Duty implementation. In terms of community empowerment, you've already mentioned that in terms of engaging with communities and looking at your Stirling Plan and the LCPAR. Stirling's got good levels of community involvement, but you need to make sure that you build on this and make sure that those who don't have the same capacity are supported to engage too. For example, as I mentioned before, if someone's living in poverty and working 2 or 3 jobs to get by, they won't have time to engage, and making sure that it's not a stigmatising process if you're going to engage with people in terms of talking about poverty. It's about how you engage with them in different ways. And it's about doing with and not doing to, which is a kind of common mantra that you'll hear through community learning and development. So it's fundamentally important to empower people to be part of the solution to tackling poverty. And there's a huge role for community planning within that. We've also got the legislation which around incorporation of the UNCRC. Obviously, the Supreme Court ruling this week highlighted that some of it wasn't within the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament, but I'm sure that the legislation will be amended and reintroduced, and we will be able to look at that from a rights-based approach in terms of looking at supporting children and young people. So turning to recovery, and having a think about this, these are the potential areas of focus that I thought you might want to consider. Given the unequal impact of the pandemic, it's exacerbated inequality and poor outcomes for those living in socioeconomic disadvantage. So understanding this impact is really crucial in the first instance, and there are lots of studies out there highlighting what the impact has been across all the different protected characteristics in terms of areas of deprivation, the impact in terms of your likelihood to die from COVID should you get it if you're living in a deprived area. One study saying you're twice as likely. There was another one that came out from, I think, the Health Foundation perhaps, that said you were 4 times more likely to die from COVID in very particular areas of deprivation. So there's a massive unequal impact out there just from health alone, but then the impact on families and people who are then grieving and trying to pull their lives back together, and the impact on their mental health is huge. So it's really important to understand where that impact has been, looking back at your plans and, refreshing your data to understand, what's going on with your population. In terms of economic approaches, those that don't focus solely on GDP, but are about the inclusivity of the economy, will help more people. Trickle down doesn't work, and it's been proven it doesn't work. Where the idea that if the economy rises, then everyone will benefit. It's not happening. There's a lot of people who, even though the economy was getting better pre-pandemic, who are basically anchored to the bottom, and all the other boats are floating up higher and higher, and they're just drowning in debt and poverty. So there's a pathway from inclusive growth that we've focused on recently, which then moves away from growth and focuses on the more inclusivity part of the economy, and then along to developing a wellbeing economy that's built around people and not solely profit. And the Scottish Government COVID Recovery Plan sets out a commitment to wellbeing economy for Scotland. Community wealth building is one way of delivering on more inclusive economies, and I know you've considered that when I came and spoke to the partnership a while ago about it. And you'll know that Clackmannanshire have committed to working towards a wellbeing economy and looking at community wealth building within that. And it's just one of the methodologies that could help you to promote a wellbeing economy. A green recovery is an opportunity ensuring a just transition to net zero. So partners can work together on this. From how you manage your assets, how you procure more green power, things like that. You can maybe do that in concert even, but also in your role to promote community empowerment. You can work with communities to do their part too through things like community involvement charters, and also using the Community Empowerment Act, working with communities to develop services that meet their needs in the new post-COVID and eventually post-COVID world, and making sure they're the heart of that service development and delivery, because things have changed and we need to do better, and they need to be involved in the things that are going to make life better for them. And all of these have co-benefits across them. For example, action to decarbonise can lead to the creation of new jobs in the low carbon economy, skills and training for those in high carbon industries to support a just transition. There's economic benefits from community energy schemes, investment opportunities, reduced energy costs, skills and training, creation of better places to do business, get reduced congestion, and that can support a thriving economy for all. But it can also lead to more efficient homes and increased access to affordable warmth, reduced use of combustion engine vehicles resulting in cleaner air, increased levels of activity through walking and cycling, and reduced consumption of meat and dairy products leading to improved health. So we need to consider all of these together and how that all comes together to amplify and multiply the positive benefits that you can get out of all of them. You'll be familiar with these, so I'm not going to go through them. It's your vision and priorities for Stirling set out in the Stirling Plan, and I've had a wee think through about some of the possible areas of focus that you might want to take under each. So you as anchor institutions, I mentioned community wealth building, that's centred around anchor institutions, the big bodies in the local area, using their powers for procurement, asset management and employment to help target local people and ensure that money stays in the local area. So you could, look at economies of scale in terms of procurement and employment across the city region and the whole of the Forth Valley. It's not just about Stirling, but access to wider opportunities. So, for example, in partnership with Clacks, who don't have the range of businesses to target procurement, but they can look across Forth Valley where there are opportunities, but also then looking across Scotland as well is reasonable as well. You can look at targeting the city region deal to have opportunities for those most in need, including lone parents and those with protected characteristics. working in partnership across the region. And I know Glasgow are now kind of retrofitting that kind of approach. If you can build that in now to your city region deal to make sure you're targeting the right people, then that's really, really important to make sure that they get those opportunities and make sure it's fair and equitable. And you've got employability programmes that could be joined up to provide more experience across the different organisations for young people. For example, what are each organisation offering? Can you do things where you can offer apprenticeships, that might be conjoined between different organisations to give people different experiences and enable them to improve their skills and ability to get jobs. And you get things like your local employability partnerships as well, and the No One Left Behind approach that's developing, and Young Persons Guarantee. You can take advantage there across all the different organisations too, and make sure, again, targeting to the right people. In terms of health, you want a mentally healthy population, but you also want physical health. You want to support families, and how a place looks also impacts on mental health. So environment concerns can reduce positive mental health, and the stress of the pandemic will have a negative impact there too. Achieving, as I mentioned, employment and resilience, early intervention, targeted action, working with families, how you all work together is really, really important to support those families most in need, and share data, signpost to support and so on. And then joint working around net zero carbon emissions. Some of the things that I thought you might want to do would be to look back over the Stirling Plan through a tackling inequality, child poverty lens and the unequal impact of COVID. You might want to think about what significant step change can be made working together, because what we were doing before hasn't worked, and we have been looking at this over time, and the inequality gaps are widening, so we need to do something more. Where can we get that just effect of coming together and getting more from our collaborative, get that collaborative gain, get that added value of how you come together and work. So this big step change is needed. How can you make a difference? How do you resource intensive support for those families who are still sitting in the most deprived data zones in Scotland since 2004? What's gone before isn't making change happen fast enough. And although we accept that it can take time for change to show, transformation is needed, both making a difference for people now, as well as taking preventative action to stop poor outcomes ever happening in the first place. Partners end up working with the same families over and over again. I saw this as a community planning manager for 12 years and then working in 2 other authorities before that. But how can we develop approaches where we can work better together, identify support early and coordinate that around a person or a family to stop poor outcomes and future costly interventions? And there's issues about data sharing and things like that. How can we get around that? And if we've got concerns about families, then there's lots we can do. Locality planning, obviously you've got the Ratloch plan and plans for other locality plans. How can you enhance that? Where next? What else are you going to do? Population segmentation is really important. I keep talking about targeting and focusing on those who need the most support. There's very little in the local child poverty action reports focused on protected characteristics specifically. So, for example, lone parents who are mostly women, BME families, families with a disabled member, and so on. So population segmentation can help with identifying who needs the support the most, and the resource can be focused on those families. So, for example, there'll be people who are recently unemployed who have been in the market and will be able to quickly get back to work, but those furthest from the labour market mustn't be left behind even further. And I mentioned cost of living before, it's going up. What can the partnership do to help those in low incomes afford living, the costs of living? It's not even going on fancy holidays, it's about the basic day-to-day. And people shouldn't have to choose between heating their homes and eating. What can we do to make that a thing of the past? Just quickly, I've mentioned community involvement empowerment. This is really key and something where community planning can really focus. We've got duties there to deliver that and to resource it. You need to underpin everything with dignity and respect and take rights-based approaches. I mentioned UNCRC, but there's also human rights, and human rights are underpin everything. And people living in poverty, their human rights aren't being met. There's your rural challenge for the Stirling area. Poverty is dispersed across rural areas, so it doesn't necessarily show up in the SIMD. So do you know who's living in poverty in your rural areas, and can you take a focus on how you support them? How can housing and other physical assets be best used for communities? How can you ensure your services are accessible? And how can you sweat the city region deal to drive some of the recovery on a Stirling and Clackmannanshire basis? But what are other opportunities there across the Forth Valley? Regional working is being discussed at the Scottish Government level, mostly from an economic perspective. So it's worth thinking about how this could work for you and how you can take things forward. So I just want to leave you with some questions to consider. Do you know where you are? Do you know enough about where you are just now, given the pandemic? Can you look at your data again and find out what's going on in Stirling? Can you, as partners, use the data we all have about the area to build a more useful picture of the needs and barriers that exist now? If they've been enhanced, there'll be more people living in poverty because those just about managing won't be managing anymore. It's about reviewing where you are now, given the impact. And the new LCPAR will help with this, I'd imagine. But it's important to understand, where are you right now and what do you need to do? What has anything changed? Also, do you have shared strategic goals that you can measure your progress towards them, even if poverty rises? How well do you come together to deliver those strategic goals, pooling resources and ensuring your strategic plans and decisions are aligned, and you consider the impact of those strategic decisions on socioeconomic disadvantage and inequality of outcome? And are you confident that you're reaching priority groups? Because if we're not, there's a risk we're widening inequalities. So it's really important for child poverty, but more broadly too. And these are the groups worst impacted by the pandemic. Is the balance right between addressing crisis and long-term solutions? And other links between the two? And do you understand what the pathway is, the impact that you're having and when you might see change? The measurement of impact on outcomes is actually quite difficult to do, but if you have an understanding of where you're going to go in the short, medium and long term, that can help you understand measurement and the impact that you're having. So I'll leave it there. These are my contact details if you would like to get in touch. I'm happy to answer any questions or and happy to hear from you. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Miriam. And that was challenging. I think I was just reflecting there on the word challenge and the use of the word challenge in Challenge Poverty Week. And I think initially when we spoke about challenge in terms of challenging stigma and focusing on dignity and human rights, but I was just reflecting that there's probably a couple of other use of the word challenge that for us as a community planning partnership we need to think about. One is we are in now far more challenging times. In terms of poverty and the impact of poverty and all the things that you spoke about there, Miriam, and that creates more of a challenge, more of a challenge for our families, our communities, and for us as community planning partners, and also challenging ourselves. What are we doing? Are we confident that what we're doing is making a difference? And if it is, can we do more? And if it's not, can we do better? So thank you for that. That's certainly lots to reflect on. I'll open it up now to everybody on the call. Any questions or thoughts in and around Miriam's presentation? Thank you. Lynn.
Lynn McKinley, Senior Community Development Officer. I found your presentation, sorry, I think I've got Councillor Kane's dog's back. I found your presentation very insightful, and it was helpful for me to kind of reflect on the work that the partnership have been doing throughout the pandemic in preparation for recovery. So lots of the work that you covered in your presentation resonates with the work that is currently underway for the community planning partnership. The themes that you've identified are strongly emerging in the resource plan that the partners have developed for the 8 priority areas. But what you've also provided is a couple of additional challenge questions that we as a partnership should dig into further. So thanks very much, and I've kind of put a great set of challenge questions that I think the partnership and the partners at a senior officers group level can take forward and further develop. But what's positive for me, as well as the challenge you've presented, is that the work the partners have done over the last year, kind of gauging what is emerging from the pandemic in terms of inequalities and our commitment as partners. It resonates with what you've highlighted as the priorities. So I think we're not perfect. I don't think we'll ever be perfect, but I think we're on the right track. So thank you.
Thanks, Lynn. Any other questions or comments? think it's interesting to note there that Natalie's suggesting in the chat that we take Miriam's questions to the next meeting of the Senior Officer Group. Senior Officer Group, for those who are not aware, is the sort of driver of the Community Planning Partnership and reports up to the Executive Board. And I think you're absolutely right, Natalie. I was just again reflecting when Miriam was speaking about, we had a meeting of the Senior Officer Group just this week, so again, appropriately so, in Challenge Poverty Week. And one of our main discussions was on the Emerging Economic Development Strategy for Stirling. And how we can refocus that and make it a different type of economic strategy. So there was a really good and strong discussion about community wealth building, about fair work. I mean, very much your point, Miriam, about the majority of people who experience poverty are in work. They are working, but the economy isn't working for them because there isn't that real focus on fair work. So how can we really set Stirling's economy up to be a fair work economy and change and shift some of the sectors that are in there? So I think it was a really strong discussion and a real commitment that the economic strategy will be that community planning strategy and will really focus on trying to continue to tackle poverty in those challenging circumstances. So again, just a reflection of the timing of discussions. I think it's really fortuitous for us. Any other points that anybody would like to make? No? Okay, that's super. So thank you very much, Miriam, again. So I'll move on now to our second guest speaker. So I said this is Lindsay Graham. So Lindsay's a commissioner with Scotland's Poverty and Inequality Commission, and we're delighted to have Lindsay with us today. So the floor is now yours, Lindsay. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the kind invitation to say a few words today at your Friday closing session of Challenge Poverty Week. I'm just going to touch a little bit on the pandemic and Scotland's recovery, the work of the Poverty and Inequality Commission, and finally some personal reflections on this year's Challenge Poverty Week. Miriam, thank you so much for your presentation. You know, I really feel like everybody should just go for lunch after you've spoken because you've covered such a lot of really useful information for everybody today. So thank you for that. It's been really insightful. You spoke about debt and resilience, and the other thing for me is people being brave about change as well. So your council leader, Scott Farmer, said earlier this week, only by working together can we maximise opportunities to deal with the worst effects of poverty in our communities. He also said that the pandemic has meant a better understanding of the value of people and the value of community. I thought those were very wise words indeed. It's a moral tragedy that it's taken COVID for our society to realise the real true value of our lowest paid workers, like our cleaners, our supermarket staff, our delivery drivers, and those in the third sector who have been volunteering. It is their skills and jobs that we have relied on and still do to support that community that Scott spoke about, and indeed Miriam has just spoken about. As a former local government officer and a community nurse, I've seen our public sector work incredibly hard under some phenomenal strain to keep our citizens safe, connected, fed and informed, and that digital divide has been very apparent. So the work that's been going there has been amazing. That's been no easy task, and we've seen new thinking, innovative approaches, new systems have evolved because of the pandemic, and these give me a sense of optimism, even as we head into autumn and the winter of 2021, which I don't think any of us will ever forget. Like many of you, I've been following the media, and much of it has been about the dire consequences of the loss of universal credit uplift, not forgetting those on legacy benefits, the ending of furlough, the rise of national insurance contributions, food and fuel shortages, and to top it all off, the unlocking of the Pandora Papers, revealing all the dealings of the super rich whose lives are a world away from those of us who have been busy doing the day job. We have also seen the publication of Scottish Government's the COVID recovery strategy for a fairer future, which Miriam also mentioned. So, which if you haven't had a chance to read it yet, its vision focuses on addressing systematic inequalities made worse by COVID, making progress towards a wellbeing economy, again, which Miriam spoke about, and accelerating inclusive person-centred public services. It talks about moving at pace with urgency, positive change, and a recovery that works for all of Scotland. This very much chimes with the work of the Scottish Government's Social Renewal Advisory Report, If Not Now, When, which set out far-reaching proposals that would help tackle the structural inequalities that exist in Scotland, many of which, again, Miriam highlighted earlier. The proposals aim to ensure that everyone should have enough money for a decent life, adequate home, access to nutritious, culturally appropriate and affordable food, digital access, and have their human rights realised, and are able to participate in decisions that affect their lives. So it was good to see that report featured in the strategy. At the Commission, we believe that child poverty targets in Scotland needs to see the same sense of urgency, collective responsibility, level of effectiveness and resource allocation that was applied as a response to the COVID-19 crisis. The detrimental health impacts of this pandemic will continue to affect us all, and as the NHS does its best to cope with the pandemic, but it will disproportionately affect those whose lives are already disadvantaged by poverty, again, as highlighted by Miriam. Sadly, there is no vaccination against poverty. Recovery will require good community planning that was spoken about and building on those established and newly formed partnerships, and we must not slip back into the silo working that we had done previously. We must keep our communities informed and involved, not least of all our young people who will be bearing the brunt of this pandemic for years ahead. The Commission, which came into being in July 2019, I don't think any of us 9 commissioners would have envisaged that the last 18 months of our work would have been shaped and focused by a global pandemic. However, our duties remain the same. We advise Scottish governments on matters relating to poverty or inequality in Scotland, including the impact of policies and the use of resources. We monitor progress, and it was great to hear Miriam also talking about the importance of monitoring progress on reducing poverty and inequality in Scotland. And also we promote the reduction of poverty and inequality in Scotland. We continue to respond to requests for advice from Scottish ministers. And however, we're also developing our own programme, including gathering evidence, carrying out research and publishing reports on our findings. Some of that programme of work is to look at what will be needed to meet the interim and final child poverty targets, focusing on the key levers of work, earnings, social security and housing. For the last few months, we've been listening to and engaging with a number of organisations and agencies from all sectors across Scotland to improve our understanding on issues that affect progress towards reducing and eliminating poverty in Scotland. We asked them what progress did they think had been made towards tackling poverty and inequality, and how that progress had been impacted by COVID-19. We have heard from research bodies, housing sector, homeless charities, disability and human rights organisations, advocacy groups and statutory agencies. They all shared frontline challenges, policy impacts, offered ideas, shared good practice, some of it international, case studies, all of which will help us in our scrutiny role. We believe Scottish ministers are currently significantly off track to meet Scotland's interim and final statutory child poverty targets, unanimously passed by the Parliament in 2017. The Scottish Government is due to publish its next child poverty delivery plan in March 2022. The Child Poverty Act requires the Scottish Government to consult with the Commission on the measures it proposed to include in the delivery plan, and we plan to provide our advice to ministers in December 2021. One aspect of our work I'm particularly excited about is the recruitment of our own panel of experts by experience. We have recruited 20 good folk from across Scotland, all with varied backgrounds. I met them for the first time in late August, and I cannot speak highly enough of their passion and will to see change happen. It was humbling and inspiring to spend time in their company. Their first piece of work will be to help the Commission with our December advice to ministers. Challenge Poverty Week has been a week of bold messages for Scottish and UK government about how important their responsibilities are to struggling families and individuals across the country. And it's been heartening to follow the activities of all involved. I listened to Baron Ruth Lister's lecture earlier this week, who reminded us just how far we have to go on gender inequality and human rights. I've attended webinars while lurking on Twitter to see what local authorities and community groups have been up to. And while the buzz of activity of this 1 week of the year is pretty amazing, it is the awareness that the week brings that also is incredibly important. It was particularly timely as well with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation publishing its Poverty in Scotland report on Monday. This morning, it was good to hear the UN Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, Professor De Schutter, points on systematic discrimination and the importance of policy and legislation impact assessments and valuing the lived experience and good childcare. One of the webinars I rocked up to was about ending the need for food banks. And food insecurity has been a particularly interesting area for me personally. It was most insightful. We have school meal services within the UK unable to deliver due to shortages, as reported in the ITN news last night. Public sector catering for schools, hospitals, care homes, where nutrition really does play a crucial role in well-being and recovery, is something I feel very strongly about, that needs to be protected and well-resourced. So I'm very interested to follow the work of the Stirling Food Partnership as it evolves. You folks have had a very busy week of workshops, webinars and events, including some great activity in your schools, and I really like the artwork from Riverside Primary. Earlier this week, Natalie Masterton set some homework for you about what you learned, what you would share and what you would commit to. What I learned this week is a little bit more history about the Citizens Advice Bureau, how it evolved and how we are still dealing with the same issues that it was set up to help with in 1939 pre-war. I also learned a little bit more from Anne-Margaret when she spoke about Scotland's spirit. It's been very inspiring and hopeful this week to see Scottish folk with that rolled up sleeves and get on with that attitude, which seems to come from our country. What will I share? I'm a firm believer that along with statistics and data, we need stories to change the public perception and media myths about poverty. So I hope to share the work of the Poverty Commission's new panel and others in the year ahead. And I would urge you please to continue to share your stories and learning with the Commission. And a hat tip to Linda Perkins, who's been very good at that. What I will commit to is to keep advocating for a fairer and a poverty-free Scotland, just as you all do. And I hope to come and visit Stirling as Scotland's next city of culture again soon, hopefully, and meet some of you in person and learn more about the work that you do to challenge poverty, not just this week, but every single day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. That again, that's absolutely fascinating, and just thank you. I think it's interesting that you mentioned culture there. We've had a number of email exchanges with a number of people on the call and with other colleagues today around around our next stage in our journey towards hopefully recognition. But we've had a very specific use of both culture and sport in Stirling. Recognising that the kind of intentional use of these areas of work can also make a big difference to families and communities living in poverty. And again, that's something that we will continue to do. So thank you for that. I was really taken by your focusing in on lived experience and the experts by experience. I think that's definitely something that we'd want to pick up as an idea. And I know Linda's very much behind that as well. So yeah, I'll be really interested to see how that goes at a national level. I was also reflecting again, just quickly before I open it up, on the whole aspect of learning and all of the things that we did so well during that first phase of the pandemic, when it was, oh my goodness, we've never done this before, we need to act. We just need to act now. We need to trust each other. We need to be flexible. We need to be agile. We need to be listening to our communities. We need to make sure that our communities are empowered to do what they do best, which is responding to the needs of their communities. That worked. It was exhausting for everybody, but it did work. And we've talked at a community plan leadership level of not losing that. Your point exactly. Don't fall back into the old ways. Keep that agility, keep that trust. And if there's one major piece of learning that I want to hang on to, it very much is that. But thank you again. I'll stop talking now. And any other comments or thoughts on Lindsay's input? Thank you. I'm not seeing any hands. I think we're all just inspired by the presentations this morning. So thank you very much both. I'll move on now to the closing remarks, and they'll be delivered by Councillor Chris Kane, who I introduced earlier. Councillor Kane is the Deputy Leader of Stirling Council, and he's the convener of the Community Planning and Regeneration Committee, and also sits on the Executive Board of the Community Planning Partnership. Councillor Kane.
Thanks, Leslie. I know you heard from Councillor Farmer at the beginning of Challenge Poverty Week here in Stirling, and you're hearing from me at the end. And I think it's sort of right that you bookend this by hearing from the politicians. But the part is that we get out the road and let you guys, as the experts, get in there and do the work. So I think it's a team effort. But I think it's heartening to me to hear what you're saying, and it's also heartening for me to learn about this. and what we can do. You mentioned the City of Culture bid, Lindsay, and we're particularly delighted, a little bit shell-shocked today that we got that announcement. But if we're going to regenerate, if we're going to tackle poverty, we really have to put culture at the heart of that as well, because we really have to save the soul of Stirling and promote that soul of Stirling. And things like Big Noise and their artwork is a great example of where we can use culture to make a difference. And I think what it sort of shows in Stirling is that we do take a very holistic approach to this, and we do put it at the heart of all that we do, and we do try and tackle it across the board and across the range of services. So are we getting it right? I hope we are, but I also know that we have to do more. So learned, shared and commit. I'm just going to go straight to the commit. I commit to do more. I commit to shout within the administration of Stirling Council to do more, because that's what we need to do. Lindsay, you mentioned that I think it was this no vaccine against poverty, which is sad, but true, and something that, you know, if we hadn't found a vaccine against COVID, what would we have done? We would not have done nothing. We would have found a way to deal with it. And I think if we lose the sight that COVID and the vaccine is perhaps, I'm not going to say nothing about COVID has been easy, but I reflect on how bad it could have been had we not found the vaccine. So recognising there is no vaccine for poverty does not mean that we can shy away from the fact that we need to work even harder to deal with it. But perhaps what Challenge Poverty Week does is it's a shot in the arm, a booster to our resolve to work together, to do more, and to recommit our efforts and our endeavours to do all that we can to tackle poverty. And you also mentioned that, you know, we can't fall back into bad habits. And I was driving into Glasgow the other day, and I was reflecting in my own head as I was going in that the traffic volumes were pretty much the same as what they were 2 years ago when I was driving into Glasgow. And I remember what the pictures of the roads looked like at the height of the pandemic. So in a lot of ways, we are falling back into old habits as we come out of the pandemic. And I think it's up to all of us to grab this one and not allow us to go back to our old ways. We have an opportunity, but I think we have to tend to this opportunity. We can't just assume that it will be there as we move forward. Throughout the pandemic, we've looked at some of the community groups that have done well in Stirling. I'll mention Ladies of the Rock in Bannockburn. It formed in the early days of the COVID pandemic to deliver soup and a smile to those in need, and they're now running a food larder. So taking that enthusiasm, that need, that desire to help, and see it turning into something else is heartening, and something that we need to support. And I know that at Stirling Village Enterprise, Natalie and her team are doing a remarkable job to do that, to ensure that they have the support to keep going. Stirling Council has a dedicated team of employees in the front line of the fight against poverty. We've mentioned Thrive to Maximise a number of times today. It supports families in my wards in Stirling East and Hill Park, also Bannockburn and Eastern villages, providing support for those. And you know, when I see what it supports, providing support for those who look to get into work or to get a better job, providing money, debt and benefits advice, family support and opportunities for participants to improve their wider well-being. What could be more basic or important than that to offer our citizens? And sometimes we forget, when we try to be clever and talk about the things that councils can do, that the basics of what we must do cannot get lost. I'm also conscious that when you get politicians in a room, you know, without going into party politics, it's almost difficult to not get a politician to start pointing the finger at somebody else. And it's always some other parliament's fault or some other politician's fault. And I think what we have to do is recognise that we all must do more. And in the administration at Stirling Council, I'm certainly not pointing the finger at anyone else and saying it is their fault. If we are not doing enough, it is all of our faults collectively, and we must all commit to work together to do more and to do better, because it's only by combining and coordinating our efforts that we're ever going to stand a chance of unlocking poverty's grip. So we can't shy away from the fact that we are not doing enough. We are doing well with what we're doing, but we must do more. we have to get to work on our Stirling plan and our 8 locality action plans to get into our communities now that we have these plans and deliver the results that we all want and need to see. But today, as we reflect on Challenge Poverty Week, I hope we can also take a minute to say thank you to all of you at Stirling Council, at all of our third sector partners, everyone who's working hard to tackle poverty. Your endeavours are valued, you are noticed, and you are making a difference to those whose lives you have a professional wish, duty, obligation, whatever you wish to call it, to help, and you're doing it remarkably well. And whilst we always focus on those who are experiencing poverty, I think it's only right at the end of the week that we take that moment to remark how well you're all doing as you work within this sphere. So on behalf of all of the Stirling councillors, can I say thank you very much for everything that you're doing, and I can't express my thanks enough, but hopefully I'm doing an okay job of it. But I'll move on from now before I start reaching for the thesaurus to use different words. Miriam, thank you very much for your presentation. It was challenging. It was difficult. It was difficult to hear, difficult to see, but incredibly useful, incredibly challenging. So thank you for that. And Lindsay, again, your comments and your insights were incredibly useful and incredibly good to hear. So again, thank you for that. I think I've thanked everyone. So I will hand back to Leslie to bring the proceedings to a close.
Thank you so much, Councillor Kane, and specific thanks to you as well. Thank you. Your support is hugely appreciated. I don't think there's anything left for me to say. I think it's all been said far more eloquently than I could. So with your indulgence, I'll just close the session. Thank you very much.